All right. We have to be at least on time, right? So telling the truth and being on time. All right. So thanks for coming to RSJ talk series, one of the talk series that we're hosting today. My name is Yoon. I'm the director of Center for Advanced Media Studies at Reynolds School of Journalism. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, we have several announcements. As you can see, we have multiple events that we host every semester. And of course, this is one of the big events that we host. Other events that we have coming soon is, I've written down here actually. So First Amendment Forum is going to be on April 17th. 18th? Okay, thanks, Patrick, correcting me. And ONA Club Spotlight. ONA Club is showing Spotlight the movie April 19th. And also we have another, the forum tomorrow about, it's a very hot topic, the Obamacare and how public perceive it, presented by Ashley Kurzinger from Kaiser Family Foundation. So we have wonderful speaker and forums, so make sure you like our Facebook page and go get all the information about locations and time and everything. So today's speaker is Xiao Mina, driving all the way from San Francisco, and she's wearing multiple hats. She is an artist, she's a technologist, and she's a writer. And she's currently the fellow at Berkman Center at Harvard University. And also she was a fellow at, what is the other foundation? Knight Foundation. And she is currently a team leader at Mina, which is San Francisco-based non-profit organization, which is primarily working on news and translation services. And also, she wrote books, right? She wrote a book, and and she's also a co-founder of a research collective called Civic Beast. So the listing goes on and on and on. But without further ado, today's guest speaker here, Xiao Mina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoon, and thank you especially to Donica and Vanessa Vancouver for inviting me here. And I've been excited. I've been in correspondence with Vanessa for quite a while, and had the privilege of meeting Donica at the latest ONA. So I've been excited to actually come here and speak today. So I'm just going to switch to presentation mode here. And looks like that's all clear, all good? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm here to talk a bit about storytelling and technology. As Yoon was mentioning, I wear a lot of different hats. And these are the two hats as a technologist and as a writer. And thinking about the role of journalism, but also the role of software in journalism. And I want to propose some frameworks here, but also talk a little bit about how we build tools at Medan to kind of get at these questions. So we're building software products for journalists. And as you mentioned, my title is Director of Product. And the most frequent question I get when I introduce myself is, what does a Director of Product do? Curious if anyone has thoughts here. Think about those. I'll circle back to that. But then there's this other concurrent question, which is, what on earth is a product when we're talking about software? We know what products are when we're talking about clothing or bags, but what is a product when it comes to software? How do we define that? And what does it mean to direct that product? It's an interesting question. And then finally, what is a platform? What is a software platform? I think people have a better intuitive sense of what this is, and we can get at that. But let's go back to this question. What is a product first? Anyone have thoughts, ideas? I'll repeat them. But I'm curious if there are any intuitions about what a software product is. Not a chair, not a bag, but a software product. Yeah. An app, yeah. What's an example of an app? Slack, Facebook. Twitter. Great. Okay, great. What else? What besides an app? What might a software product be, or what can it do?
Software that does something.
Software that does something. Yeah. Great. Versus software that may just be kind of just there, just maybe in the background, maybe, yeah, okay. Other ideas on what a software product is? Yeah.
Is it a tool that you can use to make something else?
A tool, yeah, to make something else. Great, yeah. So that gets to what products do in kind of the physical world too, right? These products help you build things or make things. Great. So there's a definition that I like that's from Mike Cohn who's founder of Mountain Goat Software, and he kind of wrote about what is a product. And here it gets at these definitions. A product is something physical or not that is created through a process that provides benefits or usefulness to a market. It's very market-oriented, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might talk about this with journalism. But I thought it might be useful to think about this, at least in terms of how other people in the product industry are thinking about this. And so from that, a chair would be a product. Microsoft Office would be a product. Agile consulting services, a painting. Product can be something physical. It can be digital, Microsoft Office, apps, an ebook, streaming videos, or it can be a service. So it's kind of this wide-ranging definition. And in many ways, when you ask people what a product is, the reason it's so difficult to define sometimes is because it can be so many things. But what about a platform? Platform is slightly different in software, and I'm curious if there's any intuitions here about a software platform versus a software product. Any thoughts? Yeah.
You build the product on top of the platform.
Right, on top of a platform, right? Okay. And you have
Yeah, I would say a product is produced by a company and given to you, whereas a platform allows for others to create on that platform.
others to create on top, right? Yeah, sort of like this. Literally, this platform allows us to put literally other bunch of products on top. Yeah. Did I see a hand?
Platform would be like the telephone, the cell phone, or the laptop.
Right. Allows you to do things on it, right? Has that system of flexibility, right? Great. What are some examples of platforms? We actually heard a few today, like Twitter, Slack. Those are examples of platforms. Other platforms that come to mind. WeChat, great, yeah. Do people know what WeChat is? Yeah, WeChat, the Chinese language social network, great. Great. So these are platforms. So platforms in many ways, and here's a definition from 2009. So it's really durable. And so this was quoted in a magazine article that I was reading. But people buy products. Platforms are structures that allow multiple products to be built within the same technical framework. And this is good for companies, for software developers, but also it's actually good for people who like to build products or build things that attach to products. I think we've all heard of Twitter bots, Slack bots, things like that allow us to make our work more efficient and to allow us to do the work more effectively as well. So it's great for developers who want to try something out. They have a framework in which to develop already. So what does the director of product do? This is a question I have endless challenges describing to my family. So obviously, a director of product does things with products. Ellen Chisa has written about this with Google product, Google's product management style. Google's really led a lot of definition around product management. And so here, she really articulates that you have this notion of technical respect, that a product manager needs to have some degree of understanding of how technical specifics work. And I'm going to challenge that a little bit with journalism. A notion of scope. Google product managers have a larger scope than many other product managers, at least historically. And then also accountability. Ultimately, the product manager, the person who owns the product, quote unquote, has to make sure that it works. And according to what metrics, though? What way, in what sense does things work? This is a great visualization from Martin Erickson, who's talked about this in terms of UX, tech, and business. So UX being user experience. So the design of the tool. Is it easy to use? Is it functional? Are people like yelling and screaming while using it? There's also the tech side. Is the technology sound? Is it modern? Is it efficient? Is it stable? And then there's the business side of things, which is, does this serve the business? Is this profitable? Is this sustainable? Which is part of why it's so hard to define what product manager is, because we're often operating right at the middle of all of this. I'm neither a UX designer, nor a technologist, nor a business person, but I'm somewhere in between, and I have to understand how all three of these things work. So in the context of journalism, though, I've always felt that this diagram was missing something when I'm thinking about my role doing product management for a software company that builds tools for journalists. And so I think there's another set of metrics, another set of frameworks here that have us thinking about the journalistic value of the tools. You can think about UX, tech, and business, but if you're not serving journalism, if you're not in the service of better stories for the public interest, your product is probably failing as a journalistic tool, and you might want to think about another market. So I think it helps to be really explicit about the journalistic value of what we're building, and it's something that I'm thinking about constantly as we're going about our work. So I'm going to walk through two of our tools at Medan, Check and Bridge, and walk through a little bit about how we've done this, how we've been thinking about it, to kind of illustrate some of the process here of product development for journalism. So the first tool is Check. Check is a collaborative verification platform for digital media, and a number of folks use it. We have Amnesty International, Witness, ProPublica, University of Hong Kong, and others who have been using this tool in different contexts. And I want to talk about one of them, which is Electionland. Electionland was a project spearheaded by ProPublica and First Draft News and a number of other organizations. It was a collaboration with more than 600 journalism students and experienced professional journalists who looked at issues of any sort of sign of voter suppression on social media, private messaging apps, et cetera, on election day and a few days leading up to it. And as Fergus Bell, who was one of the co-founders, founding partners of First Draft News, Check was part of this kind of central to organizing the social news gathering. So when I talk through this process, what I'm interested in is understanding how this is in service of journalism. This is the workflow diagram that Fergus developed, and so I'll walk through this a little bit in case it's not clear for those in the back. So you have, so this is the Check logo, but we start here with search and monitoring, where people will be searching on social media for keywords like voter problems, things relating to polling place issues, voter intimidation, things like that. And from that search, they have a specific checklist of things that they need to check for. So the type of issue, originality, what's the location, what's the date and time, what's the contact info. This becomes a standardizing process. And so as I understand the process, as I'm going through this as a product manager, I'm thinking, how can I take this process, which a journalist has determined has journalistic value, and translate that into the product, which I'll talk about, and show about how we visualize that. And then people they say shrink that down into information for Check. They add it to Check. Check goes to Slack. I'll show you how that part works. And then that info goes back to the newsroom and sends tips for local journalists and national journalists who are starting to cover these issues. And so through this process, about 1,200 reports were collected. About 400 were verified within the day. I'm going to walk through how that part worked. So much of product management is about translating these workflows that journalists are developing into software that brings value. So here's the platform. Here's Check, and so Check allowed people to organize by different states that were experiencing issues, and then people could add social media right here, and then they would authenticate those media and determine the authenticity or verifiability of the different reports. So see, people are reporting long lines. That's one of the most frequent problems. So you need to verify that before you can really report on that, right? So the way that worked is people could take a claim. There's a 5-hour wait outside my polling station. They could add it. It would receive the status of in progress, right? They could mark it as this is a long lines issue. They could put the location, Dearborn, Michigan. And then there's a verification log within Check that allows people to articulate and show the work that they've done around verification and drop that in so that it's very easy to follow along. So that when you're seeing what you're seeing as an editor, you can see the process that your reporters or your student journalists have gone through. Everything that's been done there also goes into Slack. So these are some screenshots from Slack of that exact process. If you look back, you can see how each of these steps in the verification timeline pop up on Slack. And so using Slack, the newsrooms are in Slack. They're embedded in Slack for the daily work, for all the notifications. And then they can click on these to go back into Check. And then from there, you go from in progress, eventually, if you gather enough information, to authenticated. And so that's the process. That was a beta process that we explored for Electionland, and now we're taking that forward with the rest of Check. So moving forward, these are some of the newer designs that we're working on, is if you can imagine a tweet that's get added to a system, and then I'll zoom in on these, but these are system of tasks, you have bots, and then you have the verification timeline. So I'll zoom in a little bit on this, but basically, the process that we've gone through as we're building this product was learning from journalists, learning from that newsroom, being embedded in that newsroom, which was centered at the CUNY Journalism School, and then learning from people, getting feedback from them, and then saying, okay, what's next? Which is a critical part of our design work. We're very much working, a product manager who is distanced from the people who are using the tool is a product manager who's probably not building something that is necessarily useful for everybody. And so it's critical for us, for our whole team, our product team, to really be as close to the journalists as possible, knowing that that's a difficult challenge because we're based in San Francisco and journalists are based all over the world. So what does that look like? That could be a conversation for afterward. But I'll walk through the structured verification process. We realized that when looking at that checklist that I just articulated earlier, that we could actually make that systemic into the platform, again in the service of efficiency and effectiveness for journalists. And so we have a tasking system now where people can respond with free text answers so that there's a set of really early defined questions that people can answer to make sure that you answer all of them before you can mark anything as verified. The next part is ability to insert data. So a lot of tweets, a lot of posts already contain location information. They contain name information. And so the ability to just grab that and drop that right in, our tool should be able to make that more efficient. This gets to the UX part of our tool because we're trying to make these experiences much more efficient and more of a pleasure to use for journalists. And then even further than that is taking this idea of the free text response, but then allowing for radio buttons, checkboxes to allow for standardized data collection. And part of that matters is because as you collect more information, when you're dealing with 1,200 reports on voter suppression issues, being able to standardize the data becomes very important. So you can do analysis. How many people were experiencing long lines issues in Dearborn, Michigan? How many people were facing voter intimidation issues? Things like that. And so through the process of collection, us understanding the long-term view of the process, right? Understanding where the research is going and how that research will be analyzed helps us think about how we want to structure the collection of forms. And then there's also this notion of bot helpers, and I'll get back to this, but one of the critical aspects of doing verification work is doing reverse image search. And a lot of people, when they're analyzing social media, will do a reverse image search. How many of you are familiar with that, with the process? Yeah, great. So reverse image search allows you to take an image, drop it into Google, and then just do a quick search and see if other photos like that exist. It turns out this is extremely helpful for journalists who are trying to determine the authenticity of a photo, because if it showed up before, it probably might not be authentic, or at least in this context. And so we're starting to build that part into the tool. Again, making it simple so that people can just click a little button review. The robot reminds you. And so you can click review, but ultimately, because if you've done a reverse image search, you know that there's a lot of false positives. Ultimately, it's still down to the human being to make the final judgment. And the final part of this is then disseminating the information that is published. So we have a tool called Meme Buster, and this allows you to take an image that has been circulated and might be incorrect and slap stickers on it, fake, verified, things like that. We're going to try this out pretty soon, and we'll be blogging about this. But the ability to then disseminate the information, to close that loop from finding something on social media and then putting the corrected information back onto social media is a critical part of this. I think there's a lot of challenges with this approach that we can talk about, but the idea here again is to close that loop and make the process for journalists much more streamlined and simple, so they don't have to go into Photoshop to do this. They can just use the tool directly. So the other tool we're building is called Bridge, and Bridge is a tool for translating social media for news. And we had the great privilege of actually working with Vanessa Van Koor's class, and I'll talk a little bit about that as they were using Bridge as part of a larger project we were doing. But before I jump into Bridge as a tool for translating social media, I want to talk about the context here. This is a visualization from Eric Fisher that looks at the tweets by language in Europe. When we talk about the internet, we think about the ability of the internet to connect people globally. But as it turns out, when you sort tweets by language and start color coding it, those languages tend to reproduce geopolitical boundaries. So in many ways, we're actually still divided by language as much as we ever have been, and that we live in language silos. We live in different internets based on the languages that we speak. And so Bridge is a small attempt to try to address that. Just like Check is an attempt to try to address misinformation networks and verification, Bridge is an attempt to create bridges across language networks, specifically through social media. So the way it works is that we did translations for RightsCon, which is a human rights and technology conference. And so when someone tweeted in English, we would translate that into Spanish. And here's how the structure worked, is that you have the original tweet in English, and then you have a tweet that pops out. It's called RightsCon 2ES. You can see examples of this, RightsCon Español. You can see the translated tweet. 140 characters doesn't always turn into 140 characters in Spanish, and so we always provide a photo as well that shows the complete translation, and that's the translation card or screenshot. The way that works, and this is built on hours of user testing and really understanding the needs of translators, again, getting to that UX part of this, is we took, we have an iOS app, and we built out the ability to take a tweet, say this one's in Arabic, to type in your response in English. Here's the translation as a human being. But then also, and we had a great conversation this morning about the challenge of translating slang, challenge of translating hashtags, things like that. Because we're looking with social media, we also have the ability to add an explanation, an annotation. So this allows translators to drop in those little side notes that they often say verbally and that they wish they had in digital context. We also provide tools, just like with Czech, we provide machine tools. So we have a machine translation, we have dictionaries, again, to try to support the work. At its peak, sometimes translations can be done as quickly as 5 minutes, more on average, more than around 30 minutes. But the goal here, and this gets to the journalistic value of the product, is that it's a design to share. That you can permalink, you can add an embed code, you can share it on Twitter or share it on Facebook, and you can share this card that can show the original. And hopefully just as easy as sharing the original, you can also share the translation. Here's the Chrome extension, which I'll skim over right now, but happy to talk about later. But if you want to see Bridge in action, you can check out the Alex Translated Twitter account to show, and here is where we really wanted to understand what would it be like to translate social media responses to the presidential debates. So you can imagine a lot of colorful responses. And we wanted to see what that actually looks like and what journalistic value is there to that. Fusion wrote an article about it, and I love this title, and I think it speaks for itself. But it also, the visualization also gets at the two languages that we were working with for this project, Spanish and Arabic. And I'll show a few example tweets. I encourage you to check out the Fusion article, look more closely at it. We were working in partnership with Global Voices and with Public Radio International to do this, and then, of course, with the University of Nevada, Reno. So I'll show some examples of Jose Olivares' translations. Again, this was the first tweet that was featured in that Fusion article, which helps to kind of illustrate, I hope, some of the value of this for journalists, that being able to cite the tweet from Spanish, right, but cite it in an English-speaking article, and be able to tell a story about how Spanish speakers and Arabic speakers were responding to the elections. And what was great about Jose's work and Natalie's work as well, we worked with two students from Vanessa's class, and for both of them, what they did was, in addition to the original Spanish, they would also add annotations that helped illustrate other aspects of this. And so it was through that annotation that the journalism side of this came out, right? Because of their training as journalists, it was never enough to simply translate the project. And then there's one other feature here that we've added. Robert Valencia, who's a journalist with Global Voices, and Mike, he was the one who was approving translations. So this is how we ensured a certain level of quality, was to ensure that Robert had a chance to check that off and say, this looks good from my perspective. And again, it was important that we work with journalists and translators. So if I was to illustrate this workflow, it looks a little bit like this. It's like you take the original language posts, you had a curator, who is Daniela Gerson, who's currently teaching at CSUN, Cal State University, Northridge. She would curate the social media, look at that, and then find good ones. And she was trained as a journalist, but not as a translator. And then she would pop those into Bridge, into our Slack chat where we were having a back channel. Add those to machine translation would help with the first pass of translation. You had human translators like Jose and Natalie, and others from Global Voices and from the Medan community. You had an editor like Robert who then reviewed it. You had us pushing that out to social media, promoting that on social media, and then you needed a writer journalist to then put that all together and write an article. So you can see all the different pieces here, and that gets to a metric that I'll talk about here, which is cross-lingual engagement. But the importance here that I'm trying to illustrate here is that with new products, new processes, new systems, you have lots of different players and parts and pieces. And so the new tools that we develop need to really make this a seamless process and make this easier to use. And so I want to talk a little bit about the product philosophy here and get back to this visualization now that I've talked a little bit about Check and Bridge. So we're thinking about UX, again, user experience. I was talking about how to make sure those tools work effectively, make them efficiently so no one's screaming at the computer. We're trying to avoid that problem. But also the tech. How can the tech be stable? How can it be interoperable with other platforms? We're talking about platforms here. And that's why you have this embeddability aspect of Bridge and pretty soon Check. The business value is something that, that we need to make sure we need to be sustainable as a company. So obviously, we need to make sure that our revenue model is sound and that our funding model works. But ultimately, I think we've had this conversation in product management, but I think we need to have more of this conversation in terms of journalism and tools for journalism, the journalistic value. And so I want to talk a little bit about the metrics and how we work at Midan. Midan, this is some of the Midan team, and these are the robots, also part of the Midan team. We really think about robots and humans working together within our team, and so we're trying to bring that philosophy to newsrooms as well. Because we're not trying to replace the work of human journalists. I think there's a misconception sometimes when I talk about Bridge as a platform for translating social media or a Check as a platform for verifying digital media. People say, oh great, how do you do that automatically? That's not the idea here. The idea is to facilitate the work of humans with the kind of multiplying effects of bots. And right now we're exploring this, and I'll go back to this visualization, but I really love this visualization by Claire Wardle and Jenny Sargent at First Draft News. Their team is using Check as part of a project called CrossCheck, which is a exploration into misinformation ecosystems in France ahead of the elections. And so they visualize this, and what I like about this is that they're emphasizing the human aspects of this. So just to briefly go through, people are looking at social media. People submit questions by Harkin, which is a great platform for submitting questions to journalists. Goes into that pipeline, gets funneled through. You have a queue managed by project editors. Some of that data goes to researchers, and then you have Check here, which is helping with collaborative verification. Those auto alerts to Slack. You have project editors, participating newsrooms, and then you have the social media. And so you have this whole pipeline, this content pipeline of information, and it's all flowing through different tools. And recently I was at MisinfoCon, and Mark Little, founder of Storyful, brought about an analogy here. And so we're thinking about misinformation, right? We're thinking about how content flows through the internet. And when we're thinking about journalistic value, I think Mark brought out a great analogy that I think is useful for some of our frameworks. So his analogy is that instead of we're thinking about information as an arms race, as traditionally as an arms race, is to think about it as a global environmental disaster, where essentially we have this overwhelming wave of polluted information coming at us from all sources. And what we need to do is realize that journalism is now a global cause that can't be left to journalists on their own. We need more interdisciplinary practices and methods, and really to address both misinformation, but also the silencing of information, the devaluing of people's perspectives, and that there's a lot to learn from building new processes and pipelines, and building new products that facilitate that work. And that triggered a thought for me, and here's a kind of ending question that I'd like to open up for discussion, is that I've often thought about the internet as akin to water. Like water flows, it can flow quickly like a faucet, or it can flow slowly in other places and contexts. And it can, and it's water that you can put into a USB stick, carry around. The data very much flows like water in many different ways. And this is a picture of a water well, because many people can just download data from the internet, carry that around with them without being connected to the internet. But Mark's analogy got me thinking about water as also a resource that could be polluted or misused. And as we think about the role of journalism, we think we need to think about pipelines. We have this analogy of products, right? Kind of these physical objects. You have platforms where kind of anything goes. You can put products on them. But when we think about pipelines, we think about the flow and direction of content. That's not trying to replace products or platforms. It's just another analogy to think about how these tools can work in the context of journalism. And this is a photo from the California aqueduct system, which will snake all through California. Some of it will be used, some of the water is used for agriculture, some for drinking water, for many different purposes. And throughout there are all these checks, there are these filters, there are ways that people are analyzing the water and making sure it's useful. So when I think about pipelines, it helps us set direction and intentionality to our products, so we can think about the intentionality for journalism, what is the value there, and then think about new metrics. I'm thinking about this concept of content potability. Is the content potable for people, and what does that mean? How does that change our metrics? So a traditional product metric, for instance, might be time on site. Right? It might be the click-through rate. It might be how frequently people are back on the site. But when we're thinking about journalistic value, that increases some of the metrics here. So for instance, with Check, I'm constantly thinking, what is the number of stories generated through Check that could not have been generated before? when we're thinking about translation, I'm thinking about that metric of cross-lingual engagement. How many people speaking English only are suddenly now able to understand context from Spanish or Arabic? So what is the journalistic value and the impact of the tools, and how has that facilitated the work? And then it also introduces, I think, pipelines introduces this concept of responsibility, because pipelines can be misused. They can also be used effectively and well. And so, with our digital platforms that we build for journalists, we should start thinking about responsibility to data, responsibility to the public interest, and responsibility to this larger ecosystem of journalism. And that's the question I want to close with today, and start thinking about how we want to think about pipelines, both as content pipelines, which I think we've used historically with journalism. You have data pipelines, which engineers have used, but should we now be thinking about how these things can work together so that software and journalism can work in harmony and can work more effectively to create content potability. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 27 minutes left, so any question that, okay. Make sure you use your microphone.
What are the qualifications of people entering the information into the pipeline?
Yeah. So for check, each team defines its qualifications. I can speak specifically to the way that this worked with ElectionLand. So let me see if I can find that slide here. With the ElectionLand pipeline, I think it would be no different, just as a short answer, from the qualifications of working on content and journalism. So the way that this worked, though, let me pull up this here. Is that anyone who could enter the information into check they're typically student journalists or professional journalists, and so there's a basic like baseline for their qualifications. We don't, we're thinking about semi-open systems here. And then as things go through, and I think this was more clear with the visualization I did for Bridge, but there's always an editor who's reviewing everything. And so in ElectionLand, you have the concept of the feeder, who would drop things into social media and authenticate them. Then you have the catcher who would get that and then analyze it, make sure that it looks good before sending it off to journalists. And then finally you have the journalists who tell the story. That's kind of the short pipeline here. So I think the qualifications wouldn't be any different, except perhaps some technical expertise, at least a basic modicum of technical ability to search on social media. And so for this particular project, we were often training journalists and student journalists in that process. Yeah.
Was there any attempt afterwards to conduct a post-study verification?
Yeah.
What the success rate might have been?
Yeah. So the question is, was there any attempt to look post-study verification of the success rate? We're actually in the midst of that right now. So we're going through looking at all the data once more. I can share some initial metrics that we've done. So about 1,200 reports came in, 40% were authenticated. They're authenticated in about an hour on average, and then you had at least 2 people looking at things. But to your point, we're looking back now, and we're working on a paper to really analyze that and share that out. So yeah, I think it's exactly. So I think it'll be a second level of validation. And that other pipeline graph, just to respond more directly to this question, if I can zoom through, is what I like about this cross-check graph, and then maybe I'll leave the slide on that, is just like when we're talking about pipelines, some data can be siphoned off, and here, here get this here. There we are. Here you have a data pipeline that goes to researchers, and so we're hoping that some of the data that we collect and analyze here becomes useful for future research as well. Yeah. See, did I see a hand? No. Okay. Okay.
This might have been a question for some of the translators that you bring onto your team,
Yeah.
but in some cases, I mean, I know in different languages, there's just words and phrases and things that
Yeah.
don't exist in other languages,
Yes,
in
absolutely.
English and German, there are things that just don't translate,
Yeah.
word for word. And how do you approach that on a person by person level, and that translator dealing with that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And what we find is that, and the reason we build collaborative systems, and I think that's why I think we need more collaborative systems that allow people to work together, is that often when you have a difficult to translate word. This most frequently comes up with hashtags or internet slang. We were talking about this in class this morning. Is that you need a journalistic instinct to know how are we going to translate this. You can't translate word for word. But then you need a simple way to not just translate the words, but then ascribe a value to it, so that people know, okay, here's why I need to pay attention to this word, and provide some context around it instead. And so that's where translators working with journalists, working with editors, hopefully in a system, whether that's a platform or just in the newsroom, can yield to better results, because only a native English speaker will understand how to make this Spanish language concept much more clear for native English speakers. But only a native Spanish speaker will understand why this concept is interesting to begin with. And so that's why you need, I would argue, you need collaborative systems. So yeah, it's a very interesting question.
I like the idea you have human translators as opposed to just machine translators.
Yeah.
Because like on WeChat, I can read certain
Yeah.
parts.
Yes.
And I hit the translate, and there's things that come out that don't make sense at all.
Still doesn't make sense. Yeah, that's right. And that's ultimately, like, I think, especially when we talk about journalism and translation, is you can't automate these things. One, you can't automate the translation aspect. And two, you definitely can't automate the cultural translation that's required. You can have everything exact word for word, but if you don't know what that really means to that culture, you're missing out. And that's where I think journalists have an important role to play, which is why I was sharing that example from Jose and Natalie, because they wouldn't just translate word for word. They were also translating some of the cultural references that are important to understanding things.
So you have a number of journalism educators
Sure.
in this room.
Yeah.
What are the implications of this world for us in terms of developing curriculum
Yeah.
to prepare students?
Yes. Yeah, so I think, so we've been working with a number of J schools lately, and I think what's been so insightful is really understanding that when we're thinking about the value of the curricula, we already have, it really seems like schools already have strong journalism curriculums already, like in terms of journalistic value, in terms of those metrics I was sharing. But where I see gaps and where I think there's opportunities as well is to start building interdisciplinary opportunities. And so what I mean by that is, going back to that, these circles, is that is in addition to teaching journalism, is starting to think about technology and user experiences as well. What does paper prototyping work for a product? How do you code something for journalists? What is an API? How do you use Slack? Things like that that I think are extremely valuable skills for the 21st century. I myself I don't have a lot of formal training in journalism and find myself wanting to strengthen this, but I also don't have as much formal training as well in the technology side. And so if I were to design a curriculum for myself, it would be answering all of these questions in a kind of holistic way that gets at these interdisciplinary skills, but that still encourages people to specialize. I think, as I said, as a product manager, I do all of these things, but none of these things. And so, but most people will be doing one of these things. I still need people who are experts, right? So I turn to professional journalists. I turn to professional UX designers to understand how these things can interoperate. And so that's a short answer, but I hope that answers the question.
We hear a great deal about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And I would say right now, I would agree with you that it cannot be automated. But this is a perfect example of the source documents that artificial intelligence needs, where it can take all the pipeline information coming in, match it up with a journalistic interpretation of it. So when you have that combination, after a few trillion pieces of information matched up with what real journalists create from that information, I can see where this would lend itself to artificial intelligence taking over on the small level and then marching up. I'm wondering if anyone is working on that in this context or in your company.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting question and a very emergent one. So coming out of MisinfoCon, which is a conference on misinformation environments that was just 1 or 2 weeks ago, we started thinking about creating a working group around credibility standards. What is the structured data that we collect on Check and on other platforms that helps us inform machine learning systems, to your point? because ultimately we need structured data to be able to inform those systems, and humans have to collect that data, and just as you've identified. So as we're thinking about building the tools, again, going back to this pipeline concept, is how we're not just thinking about the immediate term, but also how does this help researchers and machine learning experts. And I think to your point about AI being able to handle some of the simpler tasks, I think we already have that sort of simple future with reverse image search and with machine translation, which is why we build some of those bots into the tools. So machine translation is actually a great example because machine translation, to your point, it learns over time, right? And on Google Translate, you can add information about the translation to try to improve it. And so ultimately, machine translation works right now. It works great. I travel a lot. It works great for really simple things. How much does this cost? No, this costs too much. Here's the number. Things like that. Because it works for simple things, and gradually that gets better and better. But only to a certain extent, I would argue. But I'm not an engineering expert. But ultimately, the more data we collect and annotate that by humans with a quality check, that can then feed those systems. So it absolutely kind of affirms the role of AI, but also affirms the role of the human being. And I think we can get philosophical in terms of arguing whether AI can really truly be able to do all the things that human beings do, given that human beings disagree completely on verification and on translation to begin with. So, but I do think that we need to create closer loops around these systems. Yes.
I'm curious with Bridge if when people reply to the translated tweet, do you then translate back that to the original poster? I can see the value, but I can also imagine the work growing exponentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't done a lot of that right now. It is something that we would like to do more of because, I said that metric of cross-lingual engagement, it's not enough for some people to simply read a Spanish tweet in English, but to engage back. And so we see some signs of that, some simple signs of people retweeting and starring translations, but we haven't seen as many replies. So part of the reason we haven't prioritized that is that we just haven't seen a lot of that yet, which makes us think, okay, what are we missing here? How can we redesign these systems? But then also, but also I do think it'll be very important, and it absolutely grows exponentially, which is why we need to think about different systems to be able to handle that kind of thing.
As I understood your election coverage and the way that check was used, the verification data came from social media. Is that correct?
The data. So when you say verification data, can you elaborate?
Well, you said you search for things and then.
Okay. Yeah. The data to be verified.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Social media and private messaging apps. So there was a hotline through WhatsApp and through Twitter DM where people were also sending in reports as well.
Well, but then how did you verify? What was it? What data did you use to determine whether it was accurate or not?
Yes, right. So there's a whole process. So the multi-stage process. If there's an image, for instance, one would do reverse image search. That's a simple one. And then people would then look on the social media account and then check their social media account and see if it generally looks like this person is where they claim. You can look at, for instance, previous tweets. If someone is claiming that there's an issue in Dearborn, Michigan, you can see if the other tweets that have nothing to do with the election issue are also from Dearborn, Michigan. Sometimes the reporters would then, one of the best ways to authenticate was for people to make a phone call. They would either tweet the person or DM them or some other way to actually get a phone call with that person. And then ultimately, though, everything that happened on check was considered a first pass verification, and that tip sheet became a way to pass along to a local journalist who could then do the additional in-person reporting. Because ultimately, you don't know if there's challenges with voting until you actually go to the polling place or actually talk to people. And so, again, in terms of closing that loop, there's still very much the kind of on-the-ground reporting that's critical to this.
How long did it take to close the loop?
Close the loop. So in the digital side, the way we've measured that was about an hour. And that's not closing the loop because that's adding to check to reaching some kind of authentication status. And then at this point, from the authentication status to then reporting depended a lot on the local context. So it varied significantly.
So 2 questions, but just to follow up on Bob. So then part of the value of this is helping local journalists know which tips to follow,
Yeah.
where the problems are,
Absolutely.
but more than simply following the flood of social media at any one moment.
Right,
Okay.
right. Because you had all these students who are looking at this and professional journalists who are looking at social media, which is already overwhelming enough for the average person to do. I look at social media professionally, and every day I'm overwhelmed these days. And so having that kind of support, being able to show the work, show the process, and then help a local journalist make the connections and make a determination on whether this is a newsworthy piece of information is a critical part of that loop. So
Yeah.
absolutely.
And it's a great way to insert journalism students, you know,
Yeah, that's
also
right.
to the process.
That's right. That's right. Because in many ways, and the way we think about this with Czech is that it's also a process of not just building better journalism, like better journalism stories, but better journalists, if that makes sense. Is that by walking people through a very structured process around verification, by having these structured tasks, showing the work, you're encouraging people to clearly indicate how they got to these conclusions and help an editor then make a determination on whether this conclusion is sound or whether there are additional questions to ask. And so, again, we're talking about loops here. How can we build software that helps those loops be more efficient? Because news breaks so fast these days and breaks on social media, the need to verify becomes, the need for that speed is increasingly more necessary, right? So yeah, that's how we think about things.
Yeah, that's great. I also love the analogy of a pipeline and thinking about, they can be closed, multi-user, but thinking how they are different from a platform.
Yeah.
How would you if you could describe that a little bit
Sure.
in more detail?
So I think platforms are still a great analogy, but here I think what's often missing from platforms is when we talk about platforms, we talk about there's often this connotation of openness, that anything goes on a platform. Obviously, platforms have a context, right? Not everyone is on this platform right now, but generally platforms can be used in multi-purpose ways. But when we're talking about pipelines, and the reason I want to talk about that with journalism is that is this notion of intentionality, that there's a clear end goal in sight. And there I would argue it's a story, a podcast, an event, kind of our, the new ways we think about journalistic effectiveness being as part of those end goals, which is why for me it's never enough to simply be happy with the fact that we have a lot of users on our platform and that users are spending a lot of time. These metrics have never really been the whole picture for me. And so I think as we think about what is the end goal, what is the end product, that helps us think about the entire process and structure. So that's, I hope that, answered that question. Yeah. Did I see a hand here? No?
Can't help myself.
Oh, sure, please.
So when you think of the pipeline
Yeah.
comparison, what you're really talking about is a method to collect appropriate data from the pipeline. So there's some filter there, and then an additional filter to work through the data that was collected to turn it into a story of some sort.
Yeah.
Is your company working on that, and if so, how?
Through the filtering process?
Well, that's what it is.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think our goal is to build software that helps people do that more effectively, if that makes sense. But ultimately, it's not to make those decisions. I think journalists are in a better position to think about what needs to be filtered, right? I think, and filtering might even be the wrong word, but also is curated. I think in the context of content, it might be curation, it might be contextualization, other things. Because I think with filtering, we want, we think about separating the cruft from the useful stuff. But sometimes that cruft, when we're talking about stories and content, is actually a very useful way to think about how misinformation works, how content can be misunderstood, things like that. So in many ways, just contextualizing, I think, is a useful way to think about the tools. If we're thinking about the analogy for filtering in the context of content, it might be around contextualization. And so we ourselves don't work directly in terms of thinking about filtering, but we're thinking about how we can build tools that help other people contextualize whatever they're finding on social media. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Or
If it's a pipeline.
Yeah.
The data that is coming at us daily,
Yeah.
hourly, minutely, et cetera, if it's a
Yes.
pipeline,
Yeah.
there is some initial decision being made about what you're going to collect
What
from
goes in.
that pipeline.
Yeah, that's right.
And so are you working, or how are you working for that initial decision?
The
I
initial
get
decisions,
the
yeah.
I get the second step.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a journalistic activity, but that initial,
Like what goes in here?
right?
Yeah. I think that's less our realm. Our realm is here in terms of check. And this is why I'm arguing for pipelines, is that it helps us think about how all these tools can start to work and integrate together, if that makes sense. So to directly answer your question, I think in terms of what goes in, I think that's best addressed by groups like First Drafts and Dig Deeper Media and others who are thinking about what is the process for searching on social media, and then what is actually valuable to then add in for additional work to be done. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually just kind of curious about the revenue stream and the business model
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
business. I mean,
Right.
so you are people. Is that a funny? Okay.
It's a perennial question for journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess I could see you positioning yourself between platforms and then journalism institutions
Yeah.
to try and take the pipeline from one, say, here's what's going on Twitter or Facebook, and here are some of the more relevant claims that are circulating,
Right.
and then spitting that out to institutions of the press and saying, here's what's happening there, and we can filter this through our software and provide a service to you. So, anyways, I'm speculating, but yeah, please, if you could speak about
So
that.
what is the revenue model?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I knew. Yeah, I think I wish we could answer this for journalism in general. I think we follow the similar revenue models as any kind of journalistic outlet. So, for instance, we being Medan. So we're funded through foundations like the Knight Foundation, Google News Lab, Swedish International Development Agency, and others. And then when we work with news outlets, we will often either co-fund, find a joint funding funding partner for the project, or if they already have a revenue model, we'll charge by seat. And so our model often is connected very much with how the journalism business model, which is hence my kind of response, because this is a larger question about what is the business model of journalism today, which I can only speculate at, but can't fully answer.
Yeah, and sorry, just as a
Please.
quick, is it still on? Yeah, as a quick follow-up, I would just say that, because some would argue that, in fact, it is the duty of the public, right, to determine what is salient, what is not salient.
Mhm.
And so what has sold has been fake news or whatever that may be, and that the market has decided that, in fact, that is what's popular, and it gets them riled up, so they want to circulate it amongst their
Mhm.
friends. And then others would say but that business model doesn't quite mesh with the journalistic value circle that's up there. And I think that you're right. That's one question that we always struggle with.
Yeah.
And so when we're trying to teach our students about, how to think about market demands versus the kind of imperatives of a democratic system and the institution
Yes.
of journalism.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
anyways.
And I think there's a very important discussion to be had around how an ad-based model incentivizes the spread of misinformation. And this is why I'm getting at metrics here. If we measure metric success by clicks, we create incentives around shareability, which doesn't necessarily line up with truth, as we know. So yes, absolutely. I think this is a critical question that I think a lot of people are still trying to find an answer for.
I think this is a question kind of along the same lines, but maybe takes us back in the direction of sort of esoteric and less concrete. I'm wondering about how you sort of think about, or have thought about, or are thinking about, maybe looking forward with Czech about. I know that the conversation around misinformation and sort of its, the kind of some of the moral panic surrounding it in the industry is starting to turn in the moment towards trust, and that there's sort of it's less about sort of audiences being drawn to or even misinformed by misinformation, or kind of filter bubbles and all of these sorts of concerns, but rather that at the bottom there's a sort of a deficit of trust, and I wonder, you kind of talked about this in a little bit,
Sure.
the sort of show your work kinds of parts of Czech and some of these other things. Is there a broader vision or some broader thinking, when you're kind of, sort of not thinking about a particular product or tool
Sure.
in a given moment? Is there a sort of bigger picture that you're thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And so here I'm going to put on my other hat, which is the esoteric philosopher hat. And so moving beyond products, I think we need to think, and this is why I talk about ecosystems, right? Is ultimately a product can only do so much. A product can only do what I just talked about. So, create efficiency, create effectiveness, help people do things more effectively. But the decision of what to do and how to create value of that is ultimately, I think, outside of software. And so, when we talk about trust, we need to think about economic conditions that people are in. Why is there distrust in media? What are education systems like? What are media literacy systems like? So I think ultimately we need to think more holistically, and that's kind of my personal opinion. And so a product can only do this, but we need solutions when we're talking about misinformation that encompass so many other aspects here. And to get deeper at the issues of personal psychology, communities, and how larger media systems beyond social media are also influencing this. So, I guess to answer your question in a roundabout way, I think software has a role to play, but then there's so many other roles that we need to build as a society to really address these deeper questions around misinformation. Hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah. So much as there is an answer.
Right. It's a very difficult to answer question.
Many people spoke about the filtering, the pipeline. You mentioned that there's an editor involved.
Yes.
Is there any mechanism to control the bias if there's only maybe one editor? Are there numerous editors? Talk about bias in the whole process.
Yeah, I think bias is an interesting question because any system will replicate the bias of the makers and the participants, if that makes sense. And so I think one thing that's being explored with cross-check is, and this is less in our platform now, but this is just the larger goals of cross-check. The reason it's called cross-check is that you have a number of French newsrooms working together, and then they can cross-check each other's work. And so you have different people kind of indicating, yeah, I looked at that, I looked at that, I looked at that. So I think again, when we're talking about eliminating bias, I'm not sure that seems like a very lofty goal. But in terms of reducing bias, opening up systems for collaboration and multiple perspectives is critical to that, I think. And so we don't quite have that in our tool. But again, putting on my esoteric philosopher hat, is that truth comes in multiple directions and notions of truth and accuracy. And so the more, if you can build collaborative systems that effectively bring those perspectives together, you can help arrive at a reality that we hope is less biased than otherwise. Yes.
To sort of go off that question, I'm curious about when we think of journalistic values, I think what has been missing has been race and ethnicity.
Yes.
And so can you talk a little bit about that and how that works with the curation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, if a system replicates the biases of its participants and its makers, then in many ways, I think journalism has to really address an issue around newsroom demographics. And if the newsroom itself is not diverse, if you don't have people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different genders, different perspectives, socioeconomic classes involved in the newsroom, you're going to replicate the biases of whoever is in charge. And so I think as we're thinking about systems, and again, moving beyond the product, but thinking about who is in the newsroom, who is making decisions, who is writing those stories, it's absolutely critical that the people who can make the decisions and the people who can source those stories are people from diverse backgrounds by a variety of demographics, if that's right. And so I think in journalism there's an urgent need for racial and ethnic diversity, but I think similarly for different genders and as well. So, yeah.
Okay, we will have one more question, if you have. No? I have a question.
Sure.
I'll grab the moment, right? The last moment. So you started the translation with Arabic first. Is there any reason?
Arabic. So we started with Arabic first, and that's reflective of the history of Midan. And so Midan is an Arabic word, it means town square. And so the founder of Midan was interested in, had been doing work in Egypt, and was interested in how to create bridges between Arabic speakers in Egypt and English speakers. And so there's an initial site called news.midan that had news articles and perspectives in Arabic and in English, and then helped people translate across from them. And then my own personal experience with translation was developing a translation, a very, very rough platform that helped facilitate translation from Chinese to English for the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And so we worked with a team, we had designers and others to create this simple platform. But that comes from my own personal background, having studied Chinese and being interested in some of these issues. And so, that's the short answer to the question. And then now we are trying to diversify the languages that we cover.
You also talk about Chrome apps
Yeah.
that you're developing, and as a platform, other social media like Facebook probably can also have some type of app
Yeah.
on top of the platform.
That's
do
right.
do you have current conversation with them, or
Career plans. I think there's a lot of potential there, and we just haven't prioritized that yet. I do think there's a lot of potential because of this philosophy of meeting people where they are, and people spend so much of their time on Facebook. So I think thinking about apps in that ecosystem makes a lot of sense. But right now we're just simply because of priorities, we focused on Chrome. So yeah.
right? So with my last question. Thanks for the coming to today's RSJ talk, and thank you,
Great, thank you so much.
Ann, and let's have a big thank you. So don't forget to sign up for Facebook and like our RSJ page. We have multiple the events coming up. Thank you very much. Yep.